And then it was inauguration, and your dad had gotten us tickets to go to Barack Obama, our first Black president being inaugurated. And you and I had been out the night before until like 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. Like we were really out there. And we were so hungover, we convinced ourselves that we didn't need to go to the inauguration. And thankfully, we like snapped out of it and dragged our hungover asses over to the Capitol.
Hey y'all, what's going on? Welcome back to the Stacking Days podcast, where we highlight underrepresented journeys of sobriety. I'm your host, Ray Donovan, and we're doing something a little differently today. I have a special guest. My wife, Eva, is joining us.
Hi, everybody.
And we're kind of going to do a little bit of a couples version of Stacking Days. I talk a lot to a lot of my guests on this show about the implications of that sobriety and alcoholism has on families, both spouses, partners, kids. And, this is something that Eva and I have been talking about doing for a while. We don't have anything scripted necessarily, so hopefully, we're relatively gentle on one another over the next 45 minutes to an hour. But we really just want to get into, the aspect of what role this has played in our shared lives. That you've heard a little bit about, my experience, but what I think is oftentimes forsaken in a lot of these narratives is how does alcohol, how does sobriety, how does recovery, how does that play out in the narratives and the experiences that our partners are having with us. And so for context, Eva and I have been together now for 16 years. We were young and had our entire life in front of us when we met. We still have quite a bit of a life in front of us, but young. And when we met, and we've been married now for almost 8 years.
7 years ago.
7 years?
Yeah.
It'll be 8 years. We were married in 2016. It's 2024.
Oh.
So we'll be almost 8 years. We'll be 8 years in a few months here, which is really exciting. And we have two young ones. So our son, Sebastian, who is 5, turning 6. We have a daughter, Anaya, who is 3, turning 4. So we have a little family. You'll probably hear off to the left here, my dog, Hugo. And then we have a cat that may pass through the frame. So it's certainly a family affair today. Without further ado, Eva, welcome to Stacking Days.
Thanks for having me, babe. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start this off, easy. We'll get into it, and take it step by step. And maybe I'll start asking some questions just to kind of get like the nuts, kind of greased up a little bit here.
Sure. And you want to tell people a little more about how we met, our origin story?
I mean, I guess so. Our origin stories, we actually met in a restaurant. We met in a restaurant. So Eva walked in to this restaurant that I was bartending at in Washington, D.C., bartending slash managing in Washington, D.C. She was in her senior year of college and she wanted to earn some extra money. So for the first, probably several months of us knowing each other, we were colleagues and we became friends. And then ultimately we became a couple. So that's really the story. But the funny thing about it is like needless to say, like being in the service industry, we spent a lot of evenings over gimlets. We spent a lot of evenings over shots of whiskey and beers and tequila. And for anyone who's ever, been in the service industry or in their, mid 20s, that's not uncommon. So maybe let's start there. I feel like we've talked about this peripherally over the years, but I think you've always recognized I was a little bit of a dark kind of wolf, shortly after we first met. But at what point did you start realizing that, some of the darkness that I walked around with was due to some of the less than healthy habits that ultimately turned into a problem for me? But at that time, I think everybody was doing it. We didn't necessarily know. But I'd love to hear what your perspective was on those kind of earlier days of Ray and as you were just kind of getting to know each other.
Yeah. That's a good question. And I think the answer in all of that too is what makes this experience more complicated, because those were like our golden years. And when we met each other, And, we're like getting drinks after our shifts and we're falling in love and we're staying out late. And all of that was very, fun and sexy and romantic to a certain degree. And it was very much like, even though I had never drank that much in my life, that was such a core part of how you and I connected. And, like the darkness of night was like our place. Um, and I figured out really early on that this was, I mean, I didn't have the language, or sort of the foresight at the time to understand all of what it actually meant, but very early on, because the first time you slept over, I had, was it that there was a fifth of Disaronno that I had unopened on my desk. It was unopened. And the reason that I know that it was unopened was you know, despite my own variety of mental health challenges, alcohol has always just been a treat for me. So I had purchased the Deserono and I was going to open it the day after my French exam. And it was going to be like celebratory, like have a little Deserono on the rocks. And I had sort of like, planned ahead that I was going to have this treat. So it was on my desk, which was right next to my bed. And, you had ended up sleeping over that night and I either had to go to class or you had left. And by the time I came back to my room later that day, the whole bottle of Disaronno was gone. And I was like, the one who drinks more than a little bit of like, an amaretto sour or Disaronno on the rocks or something. And it was a full fifth. And that's, when I was like, uh-oh, this isn't normal. Like that's just not something that I had ever seen before.
Yeah. I remember the Disaronno. I think it might have been your roommate Becky that opened it though, as opposed to me. It was me.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I remember that. I remember the Disaronno, and I'm sure that that was, probably a clear, some sort of a flag to you. It wasn't a flag to me at the time. I mean, I was, in the restaurant scene. I mean, I was, living in the middle of the night, that, and waking up in the middle of the day, and and most of the folks who I was hanging out with were living similar lifestyles. Now, mind you, for anyone who listens to this podcast, for context of time, this was in 2007, 2008, right? And I had already been drinking at that point for probably, a decade
Yeah. You were
plus. So like, it wasn't something that was like it was new behavior to me. It was just a new environment. Um, but as you can tell from Eva's recount, I mean, those were some of the earlier kind of foundational moments, at least in us getting to know each other. Spending a lot of time out at clubs, spending a lot of time out at bars and restaurants. And maybe I don't know what your thoughts were on like the kind of like shorter, medium term prospects of what that could look like for the two of us. But I certainly wasn't thinking about it at the time. And I think one of the issues that people who drink to a point where they have a substance, you know, an abuse problem when it comes to substances, they're not really thinking about what the longer term effects are, both health on life, that alcohol could potentially play. So I certainly wasn't, I didn't see any writing on my wall. It was just a matter of just, me kind of going through the motions of getting through the day, so to speak. And so I'm curious, like what your reality and your experience was of that, because that wasn't the only instance where you were kind of just like, oh shit, maybe,
Cool.
you know,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but I mean, we in the last like 2.5, almost 3 years now, we've likely teased out this conversation around my sobriety and my recovery and how it's played in our relationship. So we don't need to go into like the details and the instances, because I think for anyone who's been in it, we know what dark
Yeah,
days look like. They fill in your own like,
yeah.
nights and days.
But that night stood out to me as just like a treat that I had saved for my. I mean, not that I was going to share it with you, but something that like wasn't even part of our night. It wasn't like we were drinking and that sort of thing, but that in particular sort of had stuck out to me. And also, I was probably around that night too. That when we were out with your sister, And that's when like the werewolf became known to me at that point, when there was yeah, just a darkness that I had never seen before. And it didn't turn me off because I sort of had sensed it, but it was like, okay, now I have some data points that like this just isn't the way to be. But it's interesting what you say too about like you not seeing the writing on the wall, because on the one hand I think so fondly of that time, like I was saying, because like, we're like partying and we're falling in love, and like we were just out and about on the town for so many weeks or months. I don't even, it was literally a blur. um and then it was inauguration, and your dad had gotten us tickets to go to Barack Obama, our first Black president being inaugurated. And you and I had been out the night before until like 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. Like we were really out there. And we were so hungover, we convinced ourselves that we didn't need to go to the inauguration. And thankfully, we like snapped out of it and dragged our hungover asses over to the Capitol. And it was after that where I was like, then I'm like sitting there experiencing that moment in history. And I was thinking, like, I am an idiot for like not wanting to get out of bed this morning, and I would have missed this. And that's even in my own relationship with alcohol, where I was like, this doesn't feel so great for me personally, because if this is the kind of stuff that I'm going to miss, then it's not worth it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think that, for someone who has a quote unquote like normal relationship with alcohol, those are kind of like very surface level kind of, considerations, to make. Whereas like if you truly like have an issue and alcohol has a hold on you, one of the last things that you're really thinking about is the inauguration of a president. You know what I mean? Like it's just a different like perspective for one to have through life, right? So I hear you, and I think and I appreciate the fact that you bring that up in terms of like how you maybe were viewing your own relationship with alcohol at the time. But I think that I'm curious about, how did my relationship with alcohol affect me? Because I mean, going out, we are doing a lot of these things together.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then at a certain point, you kind of pulled up, and maybe you pulled up because the environment was such where you felt that you to control things more so for yourself for security issues. And I was like, I've been doing this so long, and I'm technically in my mind like a higher functioning individual. Because to bring it back to that same night of inauguration or same day of inauguration, I ended up going to work directly from the inauguration,
Like,
and from I don't know 2 o'clock until 1 o'clock in the morning. So it's
like,
another cycle for me. And it was just a matter of like, how do I get through the initial hangover? And I think like ultimately, like, yeah, the hangover sucked. But I think that the thing that sucks even more for someone who, is living that life where you're somewhat dependent, whether it be for emotional reasons and for some, depending on where you are in the spectrum, for physical reasons, you know, you, how you interact with your day to day is with alcohol is different, and how you kind of come back to some sort of place of normalcy while you're drinking is different than someone who is, what, for lack of better term, is a normie when it comes to how they drink and how what their relationship with alcohol is.
yeah. Well, and to be clear too, I think me mentioning that particular instance and mentioning my like own calculations about my own intake of alcohol, it isn't because of my relationship with alcohol. It made me realize that you can't control your intake of alcohol. And so, or like your threshold for it was so much different than mine. And that was the beginning of me recognizing, like, oh, we're not, like, I can't do what he's doing. And like, I don't have such a good time feeling this way, the way that he does. And if he doesn't see it's a problem, that, I mean, because I think even your sober self today, like, my God, if we missed that moment in history, hopefully today you appreciate, us being hungover and at least showing up to that. But that's when I started to get this like feeling of I might need to be hyper vigilant now on both of our behalfs, because if we're just going to be slumps in bed for the rest of the day until our shifts later on tonight, like that doesn't feel so good. And I know that like he's not going to want to do that. So that's why I mentioned that in the context of like my personal journey. And that was pretty like immediate to be like, okay, this is not you know, I can't go alone in this experience then because this is so central to your how you interact with the world around you after work, whatever. And I mean, it's had a to answer your original question, it has had a profound effect on me for even in ways that like I'm still sort of coming to understand because even things like, you know, if we didn't have alcohol or like I wasn't doing something where you could access alcohol, I wasn't sure if you were going to want to hang out with me. And like there's nothing worse too than like and like some nights I might want to have a cocktail with dinner or whatever, but there's nothing, quite frankly more annoying than like hanging out with a drunk person when you're sober. And you would have, a minimum of six-ish drinks every time we sat down, whether, it was a Tuesday or whether it was a Saturday. And that started to make me start to calculate like, okay, I need to be the one who's um, keeping an eye on time, like it's okay, like is the bar closing soon, or like, oh, okay, well, how many drinks, like keep an eye on budget and stuff like that. Like, we can't be rolling out of here paying $500, if he's ordering shot after shot. And so very early, it was even like tactical things like that where I was just like, oh, okay, I have to sort of keep a closer eye on these things now.
No, I mean, I think that makes sense. We've talked about that before, and and I think that's certainly a predicament that that you were placed in circumstantially, right? And and a role that you felt that you needed to play for yourself, and then also based on my understanding, a role that you felt like you needed to play for me, right? Like in
Yeah.
protecting me from myself as
Yeah.
best as you could at the time, which is which is a huge cross to bear and a lot of weight to hold for a significant, prolonged amount of time. And I said this on the show before, like alcohol meant different things to me at different points in my life, and it certainly showed up differently in my life. And because even I've been together for so long, it showed up differently for you in your life, right? Like, yeah. So our time together. So I can appreciate that. Something that you know, asking is, before I get into that, one of the things that I wanted to say is I feel like one of the you mentioned like my threshold for my drink was just so much higher, and I think because of that, and I don't know if anybody out there who's listening uh can empathize with this, but because of that, you almost feels that you can go because you have such a high threshold. The challenge for me is that at a certain point, I hit the cliff, and I generally knew like how many drinks in, or depending on what I'm drinking, get me to that point. So there was constantly a calculation in my mind around what number am I on? What am I drinking today? Because I knew that at a certain point, like especially if it was whiskey, like at a certain point, it was gonna go south real, and either like it was gonna go hard and I was gonna go internal, or it was gonna go hard and it's gonna be much more external. But even in that, I never really, and this, like I never hit any of the stereotypical rock bottoms, right? Yeah. I never got the DUIs. I never got arrested. I never got to an altercation. I still showed up to work. I still was getting my promotions. I was still like holding all of my shit down. And I think that also, for better or for worse, put someone in a position where they end up on the road that they are longer than they necessarily need to because they're not getting any external signs that they need to make some significant changes. And I think that, later on in my career, I certainly started to get some signs that were much more glaring, particularly once we had children. But, for those earlier years, it was kind of just like, I'm young, I'm free, I've got time to fucking fix this shit on the back end. And as long as I'm not found in a ditch somewhere, or like, or in, wrapped around a pole, yeah, and it's a big deal. So I think that, that in a lot of ways prolonged my relationship, and that, in some weird way this like triangle relationship that that you were also in it with me.
Yeah. I think another thing that and this is something that I think I'm still very much trying to understand and explore, but I think for, the purposes of this conversation and even the podcast too, around healing and trying to understand the opportunity for support from other people, the thing that I feel a lot of confusion and like even guilt around knowing and sort of like recalling back to, literally 14, 15-ish years of experiences that like never quite felt right. There was this attraction that I also had to the version of you that had a few drinks and was like, relaxed and feeling good. And that was the part of you that I fell in love with the most because it was the part of you that was the most emotionally available. It was the part of you that was the most vulnerable. And I knew that, like, if we had gotten in, a tip or a fight or something like that, and go to the neighborhood bar, and I knew exactly the right amount of time to let you sort of simmer on your own, and then I would show up at the bar and you'd pull me in close and you'd kiss me and tell me everything, we'd say sorry and we would reconcile and, have a few drinks together. And then the night would be done. And the conflict resolution was around that. And I was addicted to that for so much of our relationship, even though I was afraid of it too, because like if it went too far, then it was just scary and you were out of control. But there was, motivations for me to not, I mean, not, that's sort of the other big question is like, I'm not exactly sure what I could or should have done differently to support you. And that's like where the guilt comes from. But um, I fell in love with that part of you. And it was just in that, it's like just an exact like green spot before it goes to red. Um, and then when you stopped drinking, and I think that's what we've sort of been encountering a lot over the past 2 years now, is a part of you that I love, even though it was painful, has died. And it's sort of inappropriate for me to mourn that part of you because how, you're trying to recover from that. And that part of you has done, harm to our family. And like how complicated and icky that feels inside of me, where like I would do anything some nights to just like, curl up in your arms at the corner of the bar and be the last two people there and, have those conversations the way that we did for all those years before.
Yeah.
And that's the part that's hard. Of course, in turn, that means that like, we're doing healing on you being able to be emotionally connected without alcohol, which was the whole purpose in the beginning. But I think that was one surprising thing about this journey of your sobriety that I certainly haven't seen anybody talk about, where it's like a part of your person that was like really fun and sexy and, like connected to you, no longer exists. And again, like it's, would be inappropriate for you to sort of think fondly of that for
Yeah. No, I mean, I get it. And it's very true. Like in some ways, moving into a space of recovery, speaking from someone who's in it firsthand and observing someone like yourself who, who is, also, healing from this, the spirit of our lives together, is that you are also grieving, right? Like you're grieving a person who quite literally is, it doesn't exist in the same way that you know the two, right? And I think that that's part of the challenge, and that's part of what the longer term road is, because as I continue to find ways to tap into myself emotionally, I then need to pass that on so that I can open up, emotionally to you. And I use alcohol for that.
yeah, the beer shot would do.
It was a crutch for me in a lot of ways, and a mechanism for me in a lot of ways. And for some things, it worked really, really well. You know what I mean? But there is that. But the issue is that you know there is for 90% of the time, maybe 75% of the time, it was manageable. And then you have the smaller sliver of time where it was unmanageable and you never necessarily knew how bad it could get, right? Yeah. And I think that that was and for me, that scares the shit out of me. And like ultimately, yeah, like that's what, keeps me discipline towards the path that I chose almost 3 years ago is because, like, yeah, I mean, there are certainly times where I'm like, I'd love to crack open a bottle of red wine and sit down and, and do that thing. But then, when I play it forward, and when I'm talking about playing it forward, I'm not even just talking about playing it forward in the evening. I'm talking about what does this look like if I start on this path for the next month, the next 2 months, what does that look like in a year from now? And how is this going to start playing out in my life in unintended ways? I kind of already know because I've been there and I've done that. And it's just not worth it. So I think that one of the challenges is like, how do you also get to a place where you're a part of this recovery journey? And I think that's one of the things that I've probably been for is like involving you more, probably like intrinsically in like my evolution, so to speak, versus like giving you, notes on my experience that you have to go back and decipher for yourself. And, so now we're, almost 3 years into this thing. And I feel like we've got to where we're starting to come back to each other and starting to be more in partnership with some of these things that have been really hurtful to you. Uh, and also like really hurtful and detrimental, to me. And, and I think that, this platform is great. I'm able to like get things out and talk to people who are also in their own journeys. And it's allowed me to start having, honest dialogue with you, very honest dialogue with you over the last, 6 to 8 months specifically around what is this thing actually, what has it done, how deep does it go, and then what do we need to do moving forward from here? Because like just for everybody out there listening and watching this right now, this is not a conversation that we've been able to have in the past, like a true, candid sit down around something really, really ugly. We've both had to manage, in our own right and also had to try to figure out how to manage collectively, both on the backside and now on, on the other side in the sobriety space. So with that, I mean, proud of us for that. Yeah, and it's not easy, and I feel like for people who've been through it, who have a partner who's had to experience, this with them, you kind of got to give your shout out, to your partner, like thank you for sticking in this thing with me. And because I think it's also like a healing and a growing process for you too. And it's hard enough, like me doing it on my own, but trying to figure out how do I align to you if you're on your own journey. I think that's been probably the crux of like us trying to, get over the last year. Yeah. Well, and I'm curious if you had, because I certainly hadn't in my head, I sort of naively thought that once you truly stopped drinking alcohol, you would be healed. That was like my largest miscalculation. Um, what did you what did you think was going to happen in this journey of your sobriety, knowing that you're in a long-term relationship with somebody, and how was I going to play a role in supporting or not supporting you in that journey? I think initially, well, just to kind of level set, I started thinking about sobriety and the journey towards sobriety for September of 2021. Like, yeah, when were you really like, this is not good anymore? Well, years before. I mean, remember when I had that whole fucking thing with the whiskey and then ended up going to an AA meeting in Brooklyn. Well, yeah. Like that's how far back I started thinking about it. I'm not sure if that was the moment or if you had moments before that too. Well, the reason I say that is because that was the moment when I started looking for resources, right? And in looking for resources, that's when I started listening to a lot of other people's stories and recognizing very clearly that a common misconception that a lot of folks have and then realize afterward is that just because you stop drinking alcohol doesn't mean that you've solved all of your problems, right? So intellectually, I knew that going into sobriety, like at some point, now that I've stopped the drinking, I'm going to have to start like unpacking and dealing with all this other stuff, which is why I started sobriety. I mean, therapy, which is, why I started the podcast, which is, why I started reading a ton more and, so on and so forth. So like I didn't walk into this thing in September realizing that the thinking to myself that like once I stop drinking, like everything's going to be fantastic. I wasn't focused on that in my early sobriety. I was just focused on like peak soap, right? Like that was like the main, because I was like, I got to get to a point where at least I have some clarity, and then I can kind of get into the meat and potatoes of this whole thing. Um, so I didn't have that misconception, and even to this day, I'm in my early 40s. Like I have 3 decades of life that I need to address. You know, 3 decades of life that I need to address in a way that is that has been unfamiliar to me. So it really is like an overhaul of how one experiences the world around them. Yeah. People, the places, things, like, you're doing an audit on where you are in life relative to where you want it to be. Like you're trying to avoid, the thoughts of, shame and regret, and you're trying to like redeem yourself for all of these things that you either did or you didn't do, so it is a lot. But I wouldn't have been able to get there if I didn't stop drinking. So like for me, like the step one was, how do I figure out a way to get off of this thing for long enough so I can start addressing these other areas of my life that need addressing? And by the way, it just so happens that all of these other areas that I need to address overlap with areas of life, for those who I really care and love deeply, i.e., my wife, my children, and my, and so on and so forth. So, I think that it's, and I talk to people who are in longer term sobriety, like 10 years, 15 years, and I'm like, okay, I'm 3 years. I'm like a baby in this whole thing. And what I realize is that the process of evolution never ends for someone who's in this space. Yeah. I mean, it's a fantastic gift to have, to be in a space where you're constantly evaluating oneself, critiquing oneself, and trying to like better oneself, like truly better oneself. And I don't know if I necessarily would have gotten to this place if I hadn't drank as heavily as I did for as long as I did. So there is some inconvenient truth. Yeah, so there is somewhat of a gift in that curse, but certainly, so a lot of the things that I use alcohol to cope with, I mean, they still exist in me today. Yeah. It's just that I'm 3 years removed from the thing that I would rely on to alleviate a lot of that tension, a lot of that pain that I was trying to basically avoid. So I mean, it's a recognition that I had, and now it's a recognition that I'm living. Yeah. If you're willing to share, I have a few questions. But what, if you can identify it, was the voice or message that you were trying to quiet by drinking that now has been able to come forward by being sober, or that you used alcohol to help you communicate that you no longer have alcohol to communicate for you? That's a hard question to answer. I think actually it's not too hard to answer. The voice that is the voice is my voice of honesty. Like I think that I was probably my most honest self when I was intoxicated. Now, there was a thin line between being honest and then at a certain point not being like coherent, right? So I was able to express myself without inhibitions. I was able to move through spaces without like second guessing, myself. I was able to, because implicit in what you're saying, then when you were sober, you second guess moving through spaces. Oh, I do now. I do now. There's social anxieties. There's performance anxieties. There's the extreme. um, distaste for, you know, criticism. You know what I mean? Like all of these things have always existed. It's just that whenever I felt those things in the past, if I was in a social setting, I'm like, you know what, fuck it, I'm gonna get myself a, like go get me a glass of red wine, one or two of those. I'll be able to deal with this, and or so like so I think that that in a lot of ways was what it was, and so now it's like, how do I tap into this honest part of me, both honest to myself and honest externally to people around me that I care about specifically, because everybody else, like, they're going to obviously see a version of who I am, whereas you and I, we spent so much time together. Like, I have to be honest with you, right? How do I tap into that person without, my elixir, so to speak, to get me to that place? So I think that the voice that at the time alcohol allowed for was the voice of me being true. Now, problem is there was a diminishing return on that, where at a certain point, like that was off the table, and and then the drug kicks in, and the physical and mental effects that come with it, kick in, and over time, it's corrosive, right? So like how I showed up in my 20s, being able to like pop up and do this and do that wasn't necessarily where I was at in my 40s.
I'm curious within that too of is there any other, again, sort of like messages or insights that have come into your consciousness more over the past few years that you've been pleasantly surprised or maybe even terrified to welcome back into your mental space?
I mean, something that I've been thinking about a lot over the last couple of years is my own mortality, right? And it's something that I've always thought about. But I think that now, considering where I am in my life and considering that I have, you know, a consistently clear perspective on my life without the interruption of alcohol, that I view my mortality probably different today than I once did, right? Like I really try to get the most out of every day. I really try to show up the way that I want to show up intentionally every day, because I know that one day it will all go right. And I think that, prior to me becoming sober, like I was always someone who was very pragmatic when it came to my own finite existence, but it didn't have like the degree of weight, and the degree of,
You would speak about it so frequently and so casually, like,
I find myself walking through, seemingly like I thinking about how important that moment is.
yeah,
Because I'm able to be completely present, tapped into it. I'm still a human. I'm not, like I'm not going to sit here and act like I'm Dalai Lama or something like that. But I am I'm looking at it differently, and what I've tried to do is turn that into, a practice of being patient. Certainly helps with the children. I'm not great at it all the time. In our relationship as well, like, there are a lot of things, and I mean, there was a period of life where I woke up angry every single day. Every single day I was angry. I always had a short fuse. I was always aggravated. And I think that the more and more days that I put of sobriety, recovery, and this evolution behind me, the lighter that I am. You know what I mean? Like I don't, I don't pick up. Yeah, I mean, granted, I could still be triggered as good as the next, as good as the next guy, but I don't wake up inherently like pissed off, or like, disgruntled or physically like uncomfortable, like I once had. So it gives me it gives me like a really nice and welcome perspective on my own existence. And and causes me to think oftentimes about how I want my life and how I want to show up in the lives of others. Whereas when I was drinking, I probably wasn't thinking about how I showed up in the lives of others as acutely, and I certainly wasn't thinking of how I showed up for myself.
yeah,
You know, as referenced by your inauguration story, like
yeah,
it wasn't all right, whatever. I, it was not a big thing for me. It was just another day.
yeah. Well, and I think that that's sort of another example too of the complicating factor of the after effects of alcohol on your loved ones too. Because even the example of like you waking up in a foul mood, I mean, every single day next to me for 10 plus years, I internalize that as he's in a bad mood with me. He doesn't like this life with me, and he's like regretting these decisions about, me, and that, like I can't seem to ever make this man happy. And is the part that like I will have to continue to do my own healing on too, because I never considered, oh, somebody's just feeling really, really hungover day in and day out. Because in my head, I'm like, oh my God, if I'm hungover, you better believe like I'm not drinking for months. And if he feels as bad as I would feel, from being hungover, he would never want to do it again. So the only logical conclusion is like he doesn't want this life with me. He like, is trapped in this world. And that in turn had, created so much friction between the two of you, but excuse me, between the two of us. Um, and so I guess another question I have along those lines too, and you always ask your guests this sort of at the end, you ask them, what would, you know, if somebody wanted to help you, like what would you tell them to know that, you were really suffering and that you really had that you needed help. And my question to you is like, what does somebody who loves somebody who's struggling with this, what, because it's not even that we don't know. It's could be pretty obvious at a certain point. The difficult thing is trying to figure out what to say or what to do. What can somebody say, or even what you've done that you would have heard and you would have maybe not waited until, because the truth matter is you stopped drinking, yes, because you made that decision, but that decision was also made for you. And so it got to that point where you didn't have autonomy over that decision as much as you could have if you had stopped drinking in earlier years or months or whatever. So, what, if anything, can, yeah, a loved one do?
Um,
Because I never did it successfully. It always ended in a fight.
no, and to be honest, I do ask this question of a lot of people, and I don't think there is any right answer to this question. And I don't think there's any wrong answer to this question. I think it's just a matter of like having a conversation, right? So what I think is it's really hard to create a space that people feel safe in when you are also in a position where you feel like you have to protect yourself from that person. And I think that the challenge, that I found myself in, and I think the challenge that a lot of people find themselves in, which is why they're oftentimes like, and I was always so defensive because I never felt safe. And it's really hard to create that environment. But I think that,
Well, then I hear that too, and I'm like, that implied in what you're saying is that I didn't make you feel emotionally safe. So, what and there, or what didn't I do to make you feel emotionally safe enough to receive my genuine concern?
well, I think that, that it's less about the environment that you created, and it's more about the environment that I was willing to open my eyes to. And which is why oftentimes people talk about, it's not, it's never going to be a circumstance where someone's going to step into recovery unless they're willing to do it for themselves. And yes, to your point, I decided to do it one day, and you would say that my hand was forced to a point where I had to. But there are many people who would have drank through that last moment that was defining for me, but but still maybe for some wouldn't have been considered a rock bottom. You know what I mean? That's how people like lose everything.
Well, yeah,
So
that's what I mean
so
in terms of your hand being forced on that, where you would have lost.
And that would have been, a horrible story to have to look back on. Hopefully, I would have been in a position to look back on my life and recognize that. But I don't know. I think it's a really hard thing to ask someone else to do for someone who's struggling, like unless they're in a place where they're willing to get some help. And for me, like that moment in September where I clearly caused you emotional harm, physically, was more aggressive than I have ever been. Like, said things in front of the kids that I wasn't proud of. Like, I could take those things back, but I could make a commitment for it to never happen again, right? Yeah. Because you guys are important to me. And but I think that, like, unless I got to a place where I recognized that that's what I wanted for myself, there's nothing much you could have done. Yeah. And that's just for and I don't think there's like a broad stroke that you can just say this is what it is for everybody. I just know for me, I don't think anybody could have done anything for me. Yeah, it was me. Just hard to like accept too, when you love somebody, and then also thinking about, you know, those precipitous events being like, man, if I could have, I would have done anything to avoid the rock bottom looking like. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like sometimes people talk about hindsight being 2020. I think it played out exactly the way it needed to. You know what I mean? Like, honestly, like, we are here today because our lives and played out the way that it did. Um, and for as much pain as that caused our family, and having to make that transition, and we're still very much in the process of like making that transition. I feel like, I mean, we always will be, because again, for me, it's been several decades. For you, it's been, almost two. Like, we got to like really be authors of what the next several decades are going to look like. We wouldn't have got there without those moments. So I'm just glad that I didn't kill myself. Yeah. And I'm glad that you didn't get to a point where you stopped loving me. And I'm glad that, yeah, well, where I couldn't be with you, you could be with me, right? Um, so certainly not an easy question to field. I mean, I think it was pretty clear for you that I was struggling. I think that the challenge for you was, how do I address that with someone who doesn't want to touch the topic or the subject matter with, a 1,000-foot pole. And life has a funny way of like putting things in front of you that you can't avoid it any longer. I think that's ultimately where we got to. But even in that, like, it took us some time to be able to start having dialogue, right? Yeah. It's too raw, too, very intense. And, but I think at the end of the day, the thing that continues to sustain us is the fact that we genuinely enjoy each other. We genuinely love each other. Uh, and with the exception of, some, pretty low points, uh, that at least I brought to the table, like, we've been able to create a pretty nice life together with one another. So, there's a lot to redeem there, and there's a lot to feel proud about, and I feel like and I feel very, very fortunate that at least we're in a place where we can, almost have like this new lease on our relationship, and, get to know and love each other, we are today. Yeah.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, we'd really love it if you could leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify. And of course, please feel free to invite somebody into the conversation. If you feel like you have a story to share on the podcast, why not apply to be a guest? You can do so by completing the form on the podcast description or find it on stackanddays.com. That's stackndayys.com. But for now, let's jump back into the conversation.
Because what we don't talk about also is that you've also been on your own journey of like, of evolution, of becoming a mother, becoming an entrepreneur, and like all of these other like really big life things that, will stress the hell out of somebody, in addition to living with someone like myself who also has life things. And, oh yeah, he's, trying to abstain from this thing that he's been using for, his whole life to manage his whole fucking life. So, we've had a lot to deal with, but at the end of the day, like, I think that's what makes our partnership strong, even though that is the same thing that potentially could have torn our partnership apart.
The downfall. And I appreciate you saying all of that, because I think that is the thing that we need to focus on too, is like the gift that we've been given at this point of sort of reimagining our marriage and our relationship with each other. Even though it did get a little dark there for a second, but I think we've come back from that. Uh, and I'm curious too, if you if there were any parts of your identity and sort of your evolution as a human being, because again, like, you've drank through a lot of parts of your life, like since you were very young to, college and early adulthood, and then, like, you were my fiance and then husband, father of one and father of two onwards. If there was any particular chapter that has had more weight than another in terms of motivating you to be present and be sober, and really was the part where you weren't willing to lose out.
Looking back,
Yeah,
and I think the most compelling chapter of my life that motivates me to do what I'm doing is the chapter that I'm in right now,
as a father.
as a father and as a husband, and as someone who wants to be an involved friend to my partner, and someone who also wants to show up for myself in a way that I hadn't in the past. I think that is very much at the cornerstone of where I personally have gotten to in the last several years of my life journey. um but I would say definitely good, and definitely longer term marriage. Like, we talked about this like a couple of weeks ago. Like, it's one thing, like, when you've been married for like a year or 2 years. Like, and for anyone out there who's been married for 25, 30, 40, 50 years, like, God bless you. I hope we can get there. But once you kind of cross that 5, 6, 7 year mark, and then you like realize like you're in marriage, like you're like in it, and it's not what it was, in year one or two, and it's not what it was before you got married. It takes on a whole new degree of importance. At least it did for me. So, like, I think that the the sanctity of marriage, and my ring is a reminder of the commitment that I've made to you, which is why I wear it. Not that I like it necessarily, like, I had to wear it because it reminds me of the choices that I've made to be who I am as a man. You're part of that, right? So I think that, being in partnership and being a father has caused me to be, pretty, pretty laser focused on getting better,
Yeah.
and sobriety, it is just a part of that. It's the part of that betterment,
Yeah.
you know.
I'm curious for, obviously this whole conversation has been sort of, in the context of relationships and loved ones, attempts to support. What would you say to somebody who, isn't in a long-term relationship, isn't a parent, doesn't have a nuclear family that they have created, that in sort of, in what you've said, and, my experience with you obviously is like you've been able to drive towards sobriety because you have so many wonderful things that you don't want to lose. And not to say that somebody who doesn't have a partner and kids doesn't have, a wonderful, fulfilling life, but if they don't have that push of another strong bonded relationship to rely on, what internally can they connect to give them that equal strength?
Mhm. I was thinking about this the other day, and something that folks oftentimes talk about in the context of sobriety recovery, and, and what's needed to pursue it healthily is community, right? Like, having people around you. And I think that that's certainly certainly a sustaining environment for one to maintain sobriety. But for me, when I look back, it I was in search of peace, and I think that if you're at a point in your life where you don't have where you're having a problem with peace, your own internal peace, then you have to start having some conversations with yourself around why that is. And if you happen to be drinking consistently a little too much and you can't leave it alone for a period of time, um, then you have to ask yourself, what role does this substance play in me not being able to get my hands around some peace? And, so you don't need to have kids for that conversation.
Yeah.
You don't need to have a significant other to have that conversation. You just need to have a conversation with yourself and be honest with yourself. And for me, this is all about, it comes down to honesty and transparency. And that begins first and foremost with the conversation you're having with yourself. And so if you ask yourself, where are you? Where do you sit on your peace spectrum? And you're not anywhere near where you feel like you want to be, then, maybe you have to have some secondary and third questions for yourself.
Yeah.
What you're doing and how you're spending your time. And certainly if you get to a point where there's certain things that are unmanageable in your life and you can't for the life of you figure out how to make your way through through the fog to manage some of these aspects of your life, then that's another reason to have some real honest conversations with yourself around what is the common denominator here that potentially could be preventing me from getting my hand on some things that I think that I deserve as a human being.
Yeah. I think that's valuable, and I mean, complicated too by the fact I'm sure that like there's so much privacy and shame sort of around all of that also, where it's hard to face those conversations, even internally at a certain point when just the stigma around drinking is so intense already that it's already demotivating to connect with other people, let alone um create community from that.
Any point in time, there's nothing easy about this.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing easy about this, and there's nothing easy about life. So the determinant factor as to whether or not you're going to be able to live the life that you want to live is that if you are going to start living the life that you want to live, and that's going to come with having some really, really challenging conversations, and those are going to start with you. But until you can do that, you're not going to be able to move anything.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to move anything. The smallest pebble, you're not going to be able to move. And so I think that ultimately it comes down to having some honest conversations, and yeah, sometimes it's so difficult to create a safe environment for yourself to have those conversations. But I urge anyone to try to push past that reluctance to have that conversation, and push past the discomfort of those conversations, because at the end of the day, there's only going to be growth that comes from them.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't be ever afraid of your own growth, even if it's a little bit painful.
Yeah, it feels counterintuitive because it feels like you're protecting yourself the second that it feels uncomfortable, but that's where the growth is.
But look to others who are doing it, what I mean? Like you don't you like you're not necessarily alone. Like you're not alone in this as an individual. You're not alone in this as a couple. There are other people who are also in it, right? So you can also gain data points, I think, from folks who have found some wins, and you can also find data points from people who have lost a ton, but learn from their lessons as opposed to having to on your own, right? So like I feel like opening up as I say this all the time, to opening up the aperture so that you can start having those conversations will go a long way.
Yeah, and I think I commend you too for you've done a good job of exemplifying and showcasing all of the different tools and resources that one can sort of patch together to be able to figure out which things work for you on this journey. And I think, even obviously the purpose of this podcast being one of them too, but I think that you showcasing, like you're saying, that widening the aperture so that people don't feel like, well, I'm not much of a podcast person, or like, well, I don't have any family that loves me to support me, or like, going to AA feels weird, and just being reminded that there's so many um different ways to succeed in this.
Yeah.
A final just a final thought and question is really just if there's anything else that I didn't ask you that you wanted to share, or anything that I didn't share that you wanted to ask me?
I don't think there's anything that you didn't ask that I wanted to share per se. I feel like, a lot came out of the conversation. I think it's probably be cool to like have one of these every, 20, 30 episodes just to like, I think there's also like an evolution in our dialogue around this that would be interesting for us to be able to look back on. And also like interesting for our kids to be able to like listen to at some point, when they're at, be like, man, my mom and dad have come a long way. And give them an opportunity to understand like why we are who we are. Yeah. So often like we look at our parents as though they're these grand mysteries, right? And we spend so much trying to figure them out. Like part of what this whole project is, for myself and also hopefully for the guests who come on, is just a documentation of the fact that we are just people, trying to figure this thing out. And I think it's really important to be able to come back to that because there is evolution there. And there is, a timeline that people can witness, that you may not necessarily recognize in the moment. And that's what moments are, right? But you string enough moments together and then you have a story. And I think that there's a lot of story here.
Yeah.
We can, share in real time, in real life with our kids, but also have this documentary where they can go back and like learn a little bit about, what has got us to where we are and then what, got us to where we're going to go. Yeah. But look, let's end it there. This dog and cat are like in the background, just wreaking havoc. Yeah. I don't know if it's being picked up on the audio, but
they're usually just knocked out of sleep.
I think they're feeding off of the healing vibes. Look, sweetheart, thank you so much for joining the show, especially on late notice. You're always
I know, yeah.
It was a good sport. So thank you, I appreciate it.
My pleasure, and I'm really proud of you and really grateful for the opportunity to take a little part in this experience with you, and also really proud of not only the community that you've built through this experience, but really proud of the individual people who have become so curious or so committed to, doing this work for themselves alongside you. So that just feels really good to be able to be a cheerleader in this space.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for checking out the show. We'll be back next week with another episode. Unfortunately, my beautiful wife Eva will not be with us, but in any case, we would love to hear your feedback on what you thought of our conversation. And if there are couples out there, who are also kind of going through this, feel free to drop, Stacking Days a note, a line, and let us know, what some of the challenges, the struggles have been for you, and how you've gone about and continue to go about overcoming those things. I think sharing those out, to the community is extremely helpful to folks who are trying to figure it out for the first time. So with that, peace out, be well, one day at a time.
I appreciate you guys listening to the Stacking Days podcast. I hope this episode added value to your recovery and wellness journey. Before we go our separate ways, let's connect on social. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Stacking Days or via the website www.stackingdays.com. By supporting the show, you can play a direct role in amplifying people of color in their pursuit of recovery. The easiest way to do that is to subscribe or hit the follow button. This way, you'll never miss an episode, all while playing an active part in creating the ecosystem where diverse voices in healing matter. This show is for the purpose of education and connection and is not a replacement for therapy or recovery care. For more information on the resources and support available, take a look at SAMHSA and some other resources shared in the description. Until we meet again, be well, one day at a time.